Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web and at Safe Camp Audio on all social media. Alrighty, it's headlines week, so no guest. You just get me riffing on the news of late child welfare and youth justice. We are going to start with a very interesting piece of legislation out of Minnesota called the African American Family Preservation and Child Welfare Disproportionality Act. It's a mouthful, and the added words to that have some significant meaning, which we'll get to in a minute. Iterations of this bill have been introduced, but not really kind of budged in the legislative process in Minnesota for years now. And then this year, it broke through with multiple committee votes, passage in both chambers, and then a conference between the bills in both chambers, and then being signed by the governor of Minnesota, which is a pretty robust process as you can compare that to sort of how things get done now in Washington. And I will say from the outset here, I would be shocked if this does not prompt similar legislation in other states. Now, not to brag, but the Imprint has been on it. We've been consistently covering this bill for years now in Minnesota. So I'm going to start our show notes kind of in chronological order, the coverage of the African American Family Preservation Act and all its iterations over the years for anybody that really wants to geek out and kind of read up on everything that we've written about it and covered. But I thought I'd take some time here to just try to walk listeners through the sort of basic arc of history with this law. So in a way, the story kind of begins in 1974 because that is when the Indian Child Welfare Act became law. And as we have discussed many times here, that law established certain requirements for how child welfare systems and even private adoption agencies handle cases that involve children who are members of federally recognized Native American tribes. Now, why was that law passed? Because at the time, up to 1/3 of Native American youth were separated from their families and placed with mostly white families or in boarding schools and residential schools. And the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA as it's largely known, became law as the mechanism to protect both Indian families' interest in staying together and indigenous tribes' interest in keeping children within their tribes. Now, both historically and at present, Black families are overrepresented in child welfare involvement and in foster care in Minnesota, not nearly at the level that Native American families were back when ICWA was passed, but it has been significant in the past. There's a disproportionality index that is produced by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Basically just kind of juxtaposes the involvement of racial and demographic groups in foster care as would be predicted by their population. So if you have a number 1 on the rate index, that means it's kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. It's even. There are as many kids in foster care of that race or ethnicity as their share of the population would predict. So in Minnesota in 2010, the disproportionality index for Black children was 2.5, and that was in the top 15 highest disproportionality indexes for Black families in the country. In 2021, so just a little over a decade later, and that's the last year available on the council's website right now, Minnesota was at a disproportionality index of 1.2, which is actually in the top 15 best. But that belies some more granular indicators of disproportionality and issues with civil rights in the state. In Hennepin County, which is comprised mostly of Minneapolis, where less than a quarter of its child population was Black in 2021, about 40% of the completed investigations and removals into foster care involve Black children. There's similar disparities in Ramsey County, which is where St. Paul is. Black children there comprise more than half of the kids whose parents had their rights permanently terminated, and that is double the national rate. But it's not just about numbers. We at the Imprint over the last 5 years have done some pretty extensive reporting on 2 cases in which Black relatives have sought to forge a permanent bond through adoption with, in one case, a grandchild and another nieces and nephews, and for seemingly inexplicable reasons been kind of stymied as systems within Minnesota. And Minnesota is pretty county strong, right? They don't have a very strong state child welfare agency. So, in both of these series that we ran, one is called Latanya versus Chisago County. The other is called Fighting for Kin. And I'll drop a link to both series in the show notes. They're both very involved, several parts to each one. But these are cases in which, you have Black relatives stepping up. They want to keep children within their family and are facing barrier after barrier, are being, seemingly put in the line behind other interested parties. In one case, for sure, it was just a white foster family that ultimately was successful in adopting the grandchild. So the impetus for the African American Family Preservation and Child Welfare Disproportionality Act was to bring into law, just on a very basic level, ICWA-like protections for Black families. And early iterations of the legislation very specifically focused entirely on that. Many provisions focused on requiring active efforts to keep African American families intact or to reunify them as quickly as possible through services and other social support networks, barring termination of parental rights based on, just solely failing to meet case plan requirements. This was all targeted specifically at African American families within the law. I mentioned active efforts there. The standard in Minnesota has been reasonable efforts, which is the federal expectation for efforts to both prevent foster care and keep families together. Put a pin in that because we'll come back to it. And those original versions did not move forward. And Khalees Houston, who has a community organization called Village Arms, she is as responsible as anybody probably for the conception of this law and its passage. At the time, back in 2021, and one of the more recent times that the bill kind of failed to move through the committee, talked to our reporters and simply said of Senate Republicans who were kind of unmoved by the tenets, and this is a quote from her from 2021, they just aren't interested in hearing anything specifically about African Americans here. Well, that is the very substantial change made this year that appears to have propelled the bill into movable territory. There are still a few provisions that are very specifically focused on Black families, establishing an African American well-being council and an African American well-being unit within the Child Welfare Agency, which kind of already has been stood up, but I think this would make it kind of a more permanent fixture within that framework. But in most places where this bill used to only say African American, a more extensive concept has been swapped in, and that concept is African American and disproportionately represented children. Now, what does that mean? The bill goes on to define that as a child, and I'm going to quote here, whose race, culture, ethnicity, disability status, or low-income socioeconomic status is disproportionately encountered, engaged, or identified in the child welfare system as compared to the representation in the state's total child population. So during the committee hearing process for this bill, there were some estimates thrown out there and discussed during the committee phase that concept basically includes about 90% of the kids and families involved with the child welfare system today. So in essence, this bill now applies this law's requirements around active efforts to prevent removals, to keep kids with kin, to limit termination of parental rights to almost everyone in the state. And I'll go as far as predicting that when it comes time to implement this law, the state will simply apply these standards to everyone in the state, because the alternative to that seems pretty crazy. Basically, you'd have to have a separate and less protective standard for parents who were wealthy, white, or Asian. And I feel like that is almost certainly going to lead to some sort of litigation if they do it that way. I would imagine that the standards that this kind of codifies into law are just going to be applied across the state to everybody that comes into contact with child welfare. Now, it is worth mentioning that years ago, I interviewed Senator Jeff Hayden, who was an early champion and chief author of this bill. And at the time I asked him, and obviously this was a time when the bill wasn't moving, if he'd be open to simply applying the active efforts provisions and things like that to everybody if that was the cost of getting Republicans on board. And he said no. And his reasoning is not without merit. It's that a concern that whatever the standard would be for all, that would kind of become the status quo. And if there wasn't an added layer of protection for African American families, then we would be back in the same situation in terms of overrepresentation. So this adjustment to the bill goes directly against, the sentiments of Senator Hayden from back then. I do know that he is supportive of the passage of this bill, though. And I imagine in the coming years, we will see if he might have been right about that or not. But for now, the big headline traveling outside of Minnesota, and I do think it will, is that this just became the first state kind of to establish active efforts as a standard in child welfare. Montana, it's a much smaller and less diverse state than Minnesota, got there last year. They passed something that was kind of like billed as like an ICWA for all bill that sort of took the term reasonable efforts and kept it in their code, but defined it so specifically, like what reasonable efforts need to be, that it might actually be more impactful than changing the name to active efforts or anything like that. It's quite a specific list of things by my read of it. So, we have in a short span of time here, the Supreme Court vehemently upholding the tenets of the Indian Child Welfare Act in a big case that we talked all about on the podcast called Brackeen v. Holland. And that included, affirming the presence of active efforts and that term and that concept of kind of going above and beyond what the federal government, expects in terms of efforts to preserve families or get them back together. And now you have two states moving in this direction of adding active efforts, when all that is required by federal law is this reasonable effort standards. But whether that is just sort of a conceptual rhetorical change as opposed to actually something that is done will be what counts, obviously, over these next few years. I think it's fair to say that this Minnesota bill's success would be defined as a sort of a trifecta of things occurring: less removals into foster care, increased percentage of foster care days spent with kin, and an increase in the reunification rate. I realize there's probably some people that are ideologically opposed to this bill, whether that's for how they feel about disproportionality as a focal point or whether they oppose, changing to active efforts. But I think you could agree that if you viewed this bill as something to pursue, the way to tell whether it worked or not would be, are there less kids coming into foster care? Are the kids who are coming into foster care spending more days on average with relatives? And are we seeing more children reunified with their parents and, tangentially connected to that, not seeing as many parents having their rights terminated permanently? All right, switching gears to Capitol Hill stuff. The Senate Finance Committee was one of the two committees responsible for moving the Family First Prevention Services Act along several years ago. It would become part of a temporary spending bill in 2018 and signed into law, thusly by former President Donald Trump. We've talked about Family First a lot on the podcast. In short, there are kind of two main driving provisions of it. One is to open up the federal entitlement, Title IV-E, which kind of heretofore paid mostly for foster care and adoption, to services that could be used to prevent foster care in some child welfare situations. And then on the back end, it limits federal funding to spend on group care for kids who are in foster care, so like group homes, residential programs, etc. So last month, the Senate Finance Committee held a hearing to discuss what needed to be done to get more states going when it comes to tapping into those front-end funds I talked about in Family First. And they also took time during that hearing to voice their frustration with the Biden administration about failing to respond to a letter that the members of the committee sent several months previous, asking pretty much the same question to the administration directly. What barriers do you guys see to more states making use of this funding? And I'll just say, kind of quick tangent here, the majority of states have opted into Family First funding on the front end. They have had their service plans approved, so they have the green light to start tapping in, or at least are, under review to get that green light. I think there's only 4 states that haven't opted in at this point, but that's very different than actually using it. And I think that's what they're trying to get to the bottom of, is there's not a lot of money going out the door to pay for or support foster care prevention services under this bill. What's going on? So Rebecca Jones-Gaston, who's one of Biden's top child welfare officials, was a witness at the hearing, assured the senators they'd be hearing from the administration soon. As far as issues raised by witnesses at the hearing in terms of how to improve things with Family First, here's just a few of the things that were thrown out there, both by Jones-Gaston and other witnesses. Restoring funding to the clearinghouse. There's a clearinghouse that kind of reviews and approves or rejects possible, models or programs for funding under the act. The budget of the clearinghouse took kind of a sharp haircut in the last budget round. So there was some, hinting at that will have a deleterious effect on things getting speeded up and kind of moving along in terms of like approving more programs to be funded. One other idea, expanding who is eligible for Family First to include any family at risk of child welfare involvement, which would kind of expand upon the more literal interpretation that some states are taking that a family needs to be on the verge of actually losing a kid to foster care. So that's kind of a subtle but important difference. At risk of child welfare involvement is kind of much more upstream than sort of saying to a parent or putting on paper in their documentation, like, if you don't accept these services, we will probably take your kid into foster care. That's a smaller universe of kids and, does put everybody into a position where they're kind of putting on paper that is the situation. And then just a third one, expanding what services are eligible for 4E prevention dollars. Right now, that is very focused on substance abuse services, mental health interventions, and parenting supports. The idea that was kind of thrown out there was to include anti-poverty programs, particularly for, moments of acute stress. And that might include things as, just concrete supports and housing support and things like that. So I'll link to Michael Fitzgerald's reporting on this hearing from our Youth Services Insider section for anybody that wants a little more detail. All right, we are going to take a quick break for a read from our sponsor for this episode, and then we'll be back with more headlines.
The National Association of Counsel for Children advances children's and parents' rights by supporting a diverse, inclusive community of child welfare lawyers to provide zealous legal representation, and by advocating for equitable anti-racist solutions co-designed by people with lived experience. Learn more at naccchildlaw.org, counselforkids.org, and at our National Child Welfare Law Conference this August.
All right, let's do some more local headlines, including some really great stuff by our Imprint reporters, but we're going to start with a story out of Florida, reported by Carol Marvin Miller of the Miami Herald, where a pretty dark case between the Department of Children and Families and one of its former employees, who was the state's first child's ombudsperson, speaks to a bigger issue in child welfare. So just to summarize this, and I'll drop a link, of course, to anybody who wants to read the full story here by Carol. Heather Rosenberg experienced maltreatment herself as a child. She became the first ombudsperson in 2016 for the state. She quickly drew ire from some of the agency for what they saw as, sort of overzealous advocacy for kids and parents. Social media posts critical of the agency. Imagine being mad at somebody for being an overzealous advocate. And Rosenberg has 3 adopted children herself, all of whom had been identified as high need. And one of them is in a residential facility. And the state is seeking felony abandonment charges against Rosenberg because she is currently refusing to bring her adopted son home. Now, first, that is highly irregular. The felony charges, as Ms. Miller reports in her story, is something that, experts basically say never happens. And this happens quite often, where parents or adoptive parents simply will not take a child with serious behavioral issues back into their house because they're more often than not afraid for the safety of other kids in the house. And in this case, Rosenberg is asserting that the reason she will not take her son out of the program right now is because the state has not been able to provide the in-home services that she feels would be necessary to make the situation safe for her 2 other adopted children. And then DCF has kind of countered, saying that they are willing to provide an in-home worker for a good chunk of the day, but Rosenberg is arguing that it is not enough. So again, I'll link to the full story here, but I do think that this speaks to, at least 2 kind of bigger picture issues, in the child welfare system and in the universe of just child protection. One is this delta between what residential programs can provide and what community in-home supports are available. Rosenberg calls, her area of Florida a desert in terms of in-home supports. So basically kind of intimating that, even if Florida DCF was willing to pay for certain services that she wants, she can't actually find anybody that's willing to do it in her area. So this sort of the way in which the paucity of available supports in the community yields the use of congregate care, which then leads to situations where, residential programs are pushing to have a kid released and parents not feeling good about it. That's one. And then the other one, as the great reporting and data mining from USA Today a couple of years ago kind of surfaced, is just how much in need of mental health supports and work on trauma youth who are adopted from foster care really need as they get older. And that is not something that it's not an easy situation, in that it may not be the case right at the time of adoption. It may be a situation where that sort of bomb is ticking and goes off later, and they're in a tremendous need of behavioral health support, down the line. We mentioned a couple months ago a lawsuit that was about to get underway in Oregon. It's called Wyatt B v. Kotek. It was filed in 2019. And the relief was sought on behalf of, all foster youth, but there's a couple of kind of focal points: kids with disabilities, kids who are sexual or gender minorities, and then older youth who are aging out of foster care. And at the time, I mentioned that what was interesting kind of about this lawsuit was filed at a time when the system was much, much bigger than it was at the time that this trial was about to start. So, when this was filed, there were 7,000 to 8,000 kids in foster care. That was down to 2,500 youth in March of 2023 when we asked them for the Who Cares project that we run. It's fostercarecapacity.org if you want to check out Oregon's state profile, or really any other state. So just days before this trial was supposed to start, the judge granted both sides some more time to work on a settlement, and that is indeed what happened. They settled. So under this settlement, which I thought was kind of interesting, I'm not going to say that it's novel or the first time that it's ever been done this way, but what's going to happen is the state will contract with a mutually agreed upon neutral expert who's going to do this very sweeping assessment of the foster care system that will for sure focus on quality of placements, reentry rates, timeliness of case planning, healthcare assessments, notification and delivery of required reports, and then, up to, I think it's phrased as up to 2 additional findings to be named by the neutral expert. So they will have to have wrapped that work up by April of 2025 with a little bit of a grace period into the summer. And then the settlement basically ends when that neutral expert determines that whatever their findings and recommendations are, that the state is kind of within compliance of those, or 10 years, whichever one is sooner. So either the state can, I don't want to put this too crassly, the state could, spend 10 years not doing a better job and this thing would end. Although I would assume probably people would take them right back to court if that was the case. Or they can wrap it up at any point, really. I mean, if they could demonstrate to this neutral expert that they were well and within compliance in 2 years, I guess that could be the case. So anyway, like I said, there definitely could have been instances in the past where something like that was forged. I'm not aware of it. But since we had mentioned that this was about to go to trial, I thought it was only right to mention to folks that, in fact, it did not. It went the settlement route, and off goes Oregon to wait for this, first to find the neutral expert and then to find out what they say. All right, and as always, we will end headlines with a rundown of some of the great pieces produced by our staff here at the Imprint. Just a few of the many great articles that we have published in the last month or so that I wanted to commend to folks. So first we have the work we've done with great Imprint contributor Stephen Yoder on kinship care practices in New York State. New York State has, on paper and on the state level, articulated a desire to move much more into reliance on relatives to care for kids who are removed from their families. New York State, kind of like Minnesota, I mentioned back in the first story that we talked about today, is very county strong. There is a state child welfare agency, obviously, but they sort of monitor and distribute money, but it's really the work of child welfare is done on a county level in New York. So what Mr. Yoder did was go in and use dozens of interviews and lots of public information requesting to find the kinship care usage rates in virtually all, I should say, there were a few we couldn't find, but virtually all of New York's many counties. And then we put together this 2-part analytical series on the practice of kinship care in New York State. So in part 1 of the series, you will read about how the state overall has moved to a greater reliance on using kin in cases where kids come formally into foster care, but that is a very uneven move forward. There are, for example, some counties where there's virtually no children in foster care who live with their relatives, and they're just, one county line over. There's 66% or more of kids in foster care who are living with relatives. And then in part 2, we're going to kind of double click in on those counties that have really tremendously increased their reliance on kin to learn a little bit more about what exactly they did on the ground, what concrete steps led to this greater inclusion of kinship in the foster care system within those counties. So it's a great series. Took a ton of work to put that together, good graphics to help you visualize all this stuff. And as everything I mentioned, it will be in the show notes. We got another one out in New York. I think we've talked about this on the podcast in the past, but there is such a thing as the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and it has committee activity all over the country. There was a committee in New York to study the child welfare system and its impact on Black children and families in New York, and that final report from that committee has come out. This was a very contentious undertaking from the start, which is sort of by design. The requirement is that these committees for the Commission on Civil Rights are inclusive of liberal, moderate, and conservative members, but this committee really had, conflict. It started with more than a dozen members. Only 7 ended up signing the final document here. And, the chair, I think in January, resigned abruptly, citing in part, attacks on her from the vice chair. So in the end, the report examines New York, but goes well beyond the state's borders in its recommendations, calling for, quote, a new paradigm of child welfare, end quote, that emphasizes family preservation over, and I might quote again, reporting, investigating, surveillance, and family separation. So among the recommendations in this report are eliminating or greatly downsizing the scope of mandatory reporting in the state, which is actually something that one of the state senators, Andrew Hevesy, had a hearing on, I think it was last year, just to sort of get the ball rolling and talk about, okay, is that even something that we could do? Is that a violation of federal law? And speaking of which, another recommendation of this committee was to repeal or overhaul several major federal laws that influence local policy. Two of the ones that I kind of focus on are CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which is kind of the original law that kind of built in mandated reporting as kind of an expectation on the federal level. And then the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which is the law that first, foisted onto the state's timelines around how long a child could be in foster care before they were expected under federal law to seek a termination of parental rights. Go read Sushanti and Michael's reporting for the Imprint on this. There are links to, several stories that we've done in the past, but they covered sort of what the final product recommends and what people are saying about it in the story that we posted last week. Several years ago, the Imprint partnered with our colleagues at the San Francisco Chronicle to produce Far From Home, Far From Safe. It was an investigative look at California's use of out-of-state facilities, some of which had very troubling histories of abuse allegations and practices, to house youth who were in California's foster care system or in their probation systems. And that reporting led kind of in short order to legislation being introduced that was eventually signed by the governor, Gavin Newsom, that would ban the practice of using out-of-state facilities. All of the youth who were in out-of-state facilities, I think it was more than 100, had to be brought back into the state. And, the nice thing about the legislation that they passed is actually it was not an unfunded mandate because, like New York and Minnesota, we got a theme here, I guess, today. California is also a very county-strong child welfare and probation system. So what they did was actually ban the use of out-of-state facilities for these kids, but then also attach some money for counties to develop alternatives to their use of those things. Anyway, that is all to say that now a California legislator has cited that reporting as an inspiration for a new bill that gained the high-profile endorsement of Paris Hilton, who you may know has kind of emerged as like a very high-profile advocate for better regulation of these residential facilities for youth who are either in foster care or juvenile justice system or are sent there privately by their parents or caregivers. Paris Hilton did experience that herself. This bill, which was introduced by Senator Shannon Grove, is an act that would require much more transparency in California youth residential programs when it comes to the use of physical restraints on children. And I'm going to quote from Senator Grove in reference to our reporting on the Far From Home, Far From Safe series. We spent a lot of money bringing all these kids home and condemning those organizations outside of California. We want to make sure that there's transparency to make sure that these kids are getting the care they need. All right, and last but not least for this week, to leave it on a nice story recommendation, check out Sarah Tiano's feature story about the growing use of so-called courthouse dogs to help traumatized children cope with scary court appearances in rooms full of adults, many of whom they barely know. And that story starts with a really powerful anecdote about a young girl who was brought in to testify about abuse that she experienced in a Mississippi family court and really only got through it because of Remy, who was the black lab that remained by her side the entire time. I'm a softie when it comes to dogs. I volunteer, shout out to Rebel Dogs Detroit, who I volunteer with. So it's, always heartwarming to me to get a good dog story in there. On top of it being really well written, there's some amazing dog photography in there as well for you to check out. All right, that is going to do it for this week. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all your social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would really appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org or email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.